Brave color mixing is one of my favorite parts of art. Now, in this exercise, we are going to work on creating an imaginative inventory palette that we can work from. And I do it on a file folder like this because then you can save it and you can keep it and you can go back and look at it. I start with these 5 main neutrals. I start with the titanium white. This is Artist Loft. It's just Michael's cheapo brand. I have a tendency to buy cheap white paint because I use a lot of it. But sometimes I like to use a nicer white paint. Like this is the Blick acrylic. And I find that this is a heavier body. And so I like to use this when I'm actually painting. But for this exercise, I think that a cheap white paint works just fine. Then I have an unbleached titanium. So this is like a buff color, kind of like an off-white. It's actually very close to the color of this manila folder. Then I have a burnt sienna, so a very reddish, very, very warm brown. I have a raw umber. This is a cooler brown color. It's almost, it's very dark and it's very cool. It's kind of like an ashy brown color. And then I use a Payne's gray. I could use just a solid black, but to me, a solid black is kind of a harsh color. And when I'm using black in a painting, I like to mix Payne's gray with a burnt sienna or a raw umber to make just a softer black, not quite so contrasty. And I find if I use black from the tube, it has a tendency to kind of suck all of the light out of a painting. So what I'm going to do is I am going to put what I like to call a glop. Just put a glop of each of these paints onto a piece of palette paper. And I like palette paper because it's cheap. I can toss it away when I'm finished. And that serves my purpose as well. Oh no, I am just about out of white paint. There we go. So this tube of white paint will serve us well. Then I put unbleached titanium also onto my palette paper. And then I follow that with the burnt sienna, the raw umber, and the black. Burnt sienna, raw umber, and then Payne's gray. I said black, but I meant Payne's gray. And I'm almost out of Payne's gray too, believe it or not. See, I don't need much for this exercise of Payne's gray because it's so potent, but there we go. I have a little bit of each color. Or each neutral, I guess. Then of course, I got paint on me. That's just how I like to do things, huh? Okay, then I want to go ahead and I want to put 3 primary colors. So you'll have your yellow, you'll have a blue, and you'll have a red. And it doesn't really matter what exact yellow, red, and blue that you use, but I try to make them pretty true to the color. So not a lot of hue shift there. So I have my yellow, and then I'm gonna want to use a red. It's a pretty standard red color. And then I'm gonna use this ultramarine blue. So 3 pretty standard colors. So I have my 5 neutrals. I have the most white because I use a lot of white. And then I have my 3 primary colors. Now for this exercise, we're going to put a glop of a color from a tube onto our file folder. And then we're gonna mix each of these colors into that main color so that we can get an idea of how that main color reacts with each addition that we make. Now I'm going to start out, I just have a really strong affinity for like a vermilion color. I love this cadmium red light hue, and this is a Liquitex color, but I love this vermilion kind of cadmium color. So I put a glop on there, just a good little bit. And then what I want to do is I want to go in and I want to make little deposits of color around that main, technical term, glop. So I do 3 on the top, 1 on each side of the main glop, and then 3 across the bottom. So by the end, your glop, your main one in the middle, is pretty much gone because you've moved it all around. So it almost looks like a little cube or a flower. Now then, what I do is starting up here at the top glop, I mix in a little bit of white. And then I just push the paint around, mix, mix, mix. And you can see the color, it lightens and it gets more opaque. So I do that. Then I go in and I do that with the titanium, unbleached titanium, and I mix that in. And you really don't, you probably need like a 50-50 amount between the cadmium red and the light colors, because the light colors take so much to change that cadmium red, because the cadmium red has such high pigments. But you can see this version is a little bit muddier. It's the same general value as this one, but it's a little bit muddier. And that's because it's unbleached. Then we'll go in and we will do the burnt sienna. And I just take a little bit of that burnt sienna onto my brush because burnt sienna is so highly pigmented. And I just mix, 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 mix it. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to mix it all the way, but you'll find that you get like a color that's almost like clay, like dirt clay. When I lived in North Carolina, that's the color of the dirt there. After that, you move on to the raw umber. And the raw umber, it really does not take much of that either. Just a tiny little bit on the end of your brush. And we're gonna do that under the white. And just mix it in. Mix, 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 mix. And you'll see it's almost just a cooler version of the burnt sienna. It's a cooler version of that, which makes sense because it's a cooler brown color. Here we go. And then we're gonna just put a tiny, tiny bit just on the tip of our brush. Just a tiny bit of this Payne's Gray because it's so strong. And we're gonna mix it in over here. And you will see it makes a really interesting rusty color. Okay, so you can see how it's reacted, how this cadmium red has reacted to each of these neutral colors. And I like to keep this same pattern of the way that I place these colors on each of the hues that we're going to end up using, because that way I know that I can immediately tell which color is what. Okay, so we're going to move on to this yellow color that we have, and we're going to just mix it in. I need to grab a little bit more on my brush and mix it in here. I'm using a giant brush here, and you can see it changes it to be a little orangier. I'll lift this up so you can see it a little bit better. It is definitely orangier. I could add probably more yellow, but this yellow that I'm using is a very light version. It actually has some white in it, I believe. And it's a very light version of a yellow, so it doesn't have as strong of effect on a very pigmented color like a cadmium, but you can definitely get the idea. And I could add more yellow if I wanted to, but I'm satisfied by how that looks. Then I just grab a little bit of this very true red on my brush, which you can tell if you put it beside this cadmium color is different for sure. The cadmium is definitely an orangier red. And if I mix that blue kind of true red in with this cadmium, it makes like a very fire engine bright red, and it's beautiful. And lastly, we're gonna mix a tiny bit of this ultramarine blue in with the cadmium, and it's gonna make a really interesting, you would think it would make purple because of the red and the blue, but because the cadmium is such an orangey red, the color is not quite purple. It is more of like it's really more of like a rust color, similar to the Payne's Gray. So you can see how each one of those colors reacted to the cadmium red, each of the neutrals, and then each of the primaries. Now, once those dry, I could go in with a pen and I could go over and write what each one of these is. And I might do that for the base color. But if I can remember the pattern, I will know that these 5 are the neutrals and these 3 are the primaries. I'm gonna go ahead and I am going to pick maybe a mustard color. We'll see. I'll do a mustard color here so we can see how that reacts. So I'll put my glop in the middle, remember. And I'm going to go ahead and rinse my brushes here for a minute. Okay. Oh, these are still pretty. Okay. So then I'm gonna go in with my white. Oh, nope. Forgot a step. First I need to do all of my glops around my main color. So I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. So now we have a little bit of paint to mix with each color. And I just want to make sure I have enough in each, very technical term, glop. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and mix in some white up here at the top left. And since I still have a lot of paint on my brush, since I just went right in and did it, I need to get enough white to really make a difference. So I did that. Just mix or rinse out these brushes real quick. Here we go. All right, and then we'll go with unbleached titanium. And we don't need a ton of it, but we'll go in and we'll notice, again, if this is any indication, if this cadmium is any indication, it should be very similar to the white, but it should be a muddier version, and that's what we've gotten here. You can see from what I'm working on here. Okay, then we're working with our burnt sienna, and I'm just gonna grab a tiny bit on the end of my brush because it's so pigmented, and I don't want it to totally distort the color. I just wanna show what it would look like if it was mixed in. And you can see it gets even a tiny bit more mustardy or olivey almost. It's right there on the border between mustard and olive. I'm gonna go ahead and then we're gonna do the raw umber. And just grabbing a tiny bit on the end of my brush, mixing it in that same place. And wow, if I thought the last one was olive green, this one certainly is olive green. And that's because of the cooler nature of that raw umber. And then our last neutral is Payne's Gray. So, because Payne's Gray is it's actually like a very dark bluish gray color. It is very interesting to see what happens when we mix that in. And I just put a tiny, tiny bit on my brush because it is so pigmented, but you can see what a true green that really makes. So if you've ever wondered what color Payne's Gray really is, you can see by mixing it with a lighter color. And it behaves like you would expect a blue to behave. Okay, next I pull in a good bit of this yellow and I mix it in, and it just makes that mustard color a lot more of a true bright primary yellow. And that's to be expected, and it's really a beautiful shade. Might even mix in a little bit more. All right, there we go. And then I'm gonna do the same for the red. I'm just rolling my brush on the inside of my water container to kind of get that bit of paint out. Okay, we're gonna mix in this very true red with this mustard color and see what happens. Interesting. Makes a very interesting orangey color, but the thing I love about doing this kind of exercise is you really see the different tonalities of color. You can really see if you want an orange, well, you have this choice for an orange. You also have this choice for an orange. And what orange would better suit your project that you're working on? And what orange is more interesting? What orange is more nuanced? What orange has more dimension? That is what I'm interested in when I mix colors bravely. I like to have colors that are offbeat, that are quirky, that are not contained by the average idea of what color orange is. I think that that's what makes paintings layered and fascinating, and what makes it your own, because you have colors that you're drawn to, and when you can mix them, you know the kind of colors that you're making. So I'm going to do this last one and mix that mustard with a little bit of that primary ultramarine blue, and you'll see I'm going to add a little bit of water so it mixes a little easier. You'll see I get a color that's very similar but lighter than what we got with the Payne's Gray. So there you go. We have another version, another collection of colors with our neutrals around the top and our primaries across the bottom, with our main color in the center. Now, when I'm looking at these colors, I like to see even just randomly where the colors fell as I was picking just random tubes of paint out of my paint collection. I love to see the patterns that are made and the colors that I would like together. So I love this set of 3 colors right here. It's like an olive green, a mustard, and a really light lavender. I think those look beautiful together. I might use those in a future project. And interestingly, I also love this threesome that's right beside it, which is another mustard color, kind of a terracotta, and then like a really dusty, light lavender. I love those together. And that would be a really interesting set of colors to use. Likewise, I love this kind of twilight blue, this cornflower blue, which is beautiful, and then this really interesting greeny brown. I think those 3 colors together are really interesting. So as I'm looking at the colors, I really love to see in general what colors really intrigue me together. Also, let's look across this way. I think that this maroon color with this really dusty purple color, it's almost like an ashy purple, and then this bright orchid color. Those 3 colors are really interesting together. And then there's these 3 that are very kind of analogous. They would be together on a color wheel, but it's like a maroon, a mustard, and this terracotta orange. Those are beautiful. Now, I didn't pick these to be in any sort of order. I just grabbed paint tubes that I was drawn to. But as you're going through, it's kind of like looking at paint chips that are at the hardware store. It's easy for you to start to see colors that you're drawn to, kind of sets of colors. And I'm always drawn to the same sorts of colors. And so this is a great exercise to kind of, again, build your imaginative inventory, and you can start to see the colors that you're drawn to together.